This explains that there are two different ways to draw. The way that many a person draws is this way. Now, there are some things about this drawing on the right. One is that it is done from observation, which is why this is typically called observational drawing. It means that I sat at the Page Museum in LA and I looked at the American lion skeleton and I sketched it out lightly and then drew and put in some detail, and this is the kind of thing that family members are often most impressed with because it looks real, as they say. There's detail in it. Oh, that shows you took some time. You weren't in a, you have good craft there. Well, as valuable as observational drawing is, observational drawing is, for the purposes of what I want to teach you, the least useful, because it relies on what's in front of us, and the kind of drawing I emphasize is the kind that can look at what is in front of us and put it into any position we want. And the kind of drawing at the left, which, well, let's see, let's find a word for it. Let's call that analytical drawing. Now, analytical might not be the best word because you can analyze a drawing for different aspects. Let me explain what I mean. Let me get a page of white here. There, we did it. There are three areas of mastery in picture making. The first one is the one that everybody knows about, and in many ways is the least important, but it's certainly important, and it is technique. Technique can be described briefly. We could talk about it for a long time, but it's how you apply the medium, how you apply the watercolor, how you apply the oil paint, whether you use sketchy, rough lines, whether you use clean, slick lines, whether you're doing pen and ink, or whether you're doing pen and wash and ink, whether you're working transparently or opaquely, whether you're putting big slabs of oil paint on or whether you're thinning them out. Technique is really pretty much the surface of what you're working on. And of course, in order to draw or paint, we need to learn some technique. There's another area, draftsmanship. Sorry about the non-inclusive gender term, but that's how it's still in the dictionary. Draftsmanship is creating the illusion of 3D on a 2D surface, and there's three parts to it. One is you can't really draw or paint something and have command over it enough to move it around into other positions if you need to, or change the lighting on it, unless you know what it's made out of. Which parts are bone, which parts are muscle, which parts squash and stretch, and which parts don't. And it's not just anatomy of animals and humans, but anatomy of anything, anatomy of trees, anatomy of clouds. Anatomy is what a thing is made of. Let me go back. Because we can take the time, we're going to spend 5 minutes on all of this. Technique is how an artist applies a medium. So, of course, digital media have different techniques than traditional media. Draftsmanship is making 3D on a 2D surface, and it's done with three things: anatomy, perspective, that's how a thing occupies space, and one other thing. Anatomy is what your doctor knows or your veterinarian knows, and yet your veterinarian cannot draw animals nearly as well as a skilled draftsperson who knows a fraction of the anatomy that the veterinarian knows. Did I say perspection? Perspective. Perspective are the tricks of making it look like it occupies space, and it's exactly what your wireframe mode is doing on the computer. But we're not done. We don't want things to be in wireframe when we draw all the time. And so we have a third thing, and that is rendering, and that's how the surface responds to light. Whether it reflects light, bounces it back, whether it absorbs it, whether it's got a rough texture, whether it's got a smooth texture, whether it's shiny or not. These are for creating the illusion of three-dimensionality. There's one other thing that ends up being the most important, and it's composition. The reason why composition is the most important is because some of the greatest artists in history, like Van Gogh, were not skilled draftspeople in the traditional sense. And yet his choices of color, his choices of shapes, his choices of how to apply the technique one way versus another way, his choices of how big to make things or how small to make things. In short, his choices. Van Gogh's choices are what made him a great artist. And that is a whole other discipline. What we will deal with in our 6 weeks together is creating the illusion of 3D on a flat surface, because that is so valuable for people who want to draw or invent. Now back to this. You see, this skull, which doesn't really look like a skull here, is in a position like this. Got a shape, wrap a rubber band around it, and saw off the end, maybe put a little thing to let us know that the end is there. We're looking slightly, up at it or down at it? Well, I am going to choose that we're looking down at it a little bit. So I just drew another line. Let me explain what I did with that line. When I take a shape that is supposed to be roundish, and I put a rubber band that is facing convex down, that means I'm going to see a little of the top. I could have done a shape and put a rubber band around it that was convex to the top, and that means I'd see a little bit of the bottom. Well, we have the same shape, and a simple rubber band around it will determine whether we're looking down on that shape or up at that shape. That's a really valuable tool. Notice that I did it not just with looking up and looking down, but my first lines that I made, where I did the head, I said this part is closer to me than this part over here. And so a rubber band that is convex to the part that's going away from me will make that shape look like this end is closer. I could have done it the opposite way. I could have done the rubber band that way, and that would mean that this end is closer to me. Now I'm going to stop on that for a second, because I'm making a point about how you can move a form around in the simplest terms that I know how to make the point. I've never seen that in a book. It came to me after a few years of teaching draftsmanship that it's like, we got to make this simple. And so the rubber band around an egg or a cylinder or a coffee can or anything else that you can imagine that's fairly cylindrical is a start. But here's the bigger point. The bigger point is that this drawing on the right is too complicated to memorize, to fully understand. It's just too complicated to learn from. It might be impressive to family members, but it is too daunting to really be of use for people who want to control form. This one is simpler and can be understood, but even this one, in its simplicity, is quite complex in most people's opinions. So, what I want to do, is show that the most important thing that we're doing here is taking something complex, taking something complex like this, simplifying it to this, and right now, while I'm in front of you and teaching, simplifying it even further by turning it into a shape. We can do this with every part of this body. If we wanted this arm as a simpler shape, you see how if we run a rubber band and slice off that end, by the way, if you say, hey, I didn't get that thing about the running the rubber band and slicing off the end, don't worry, I'm going to do that 10 times in our next 2 hours. But see, now we know that this end is closer to us. But what if we said, I want the thing to reach its arm out toward me like that? You see how if I switch the direction on the rubber band, now I could have something that is coming toward me, and I could make the next part coming toward me like that, and I could make the part underneath that coming toward me. A little rubber band will bring things toward you or send them away. That hind leg back there, one rubber band at least apes what's going on right there. And if I want that thing to go more directly down but maybe still come toward me a little bit, I can go like that. And if I want that thing to go away from me like so, I don't know how to make form simpler than a few little sticks with rubber bands. Well, we will develop that through the day. That's my first point. Simplicity, 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 and complexity gradually. If there's any thoughts or comments about this, and Will, if you can guide me to understand what anybody's asking. Marshall voice, I can't read all the comments. Did you see the first part? Marshall's voice reminds me of a cross between George Carlin and Rip Torn. My goodness, never heard that one. Love the rubber band analogy. Wow, thanks for remembering. I am going to sneeze. I always sneeze when I get embarrassed.
Yeah, guys, if you have questions right now, like we said, we're going to be stopping periodically throughout the lecture. Either raise your hand, or if you don't have a mic, type it in chat, and I can relay your question to Marshall.
Yeah. And don't feel obligated to ask questions, because what I try to do in arranging your train of thought is to anticipate your questions. When I'm trying to get this ready, I'm trying to think, well, if I was a student, what would I be worrying about next? And there's many things we could worry about next. So I'm going to try to take you on a path. But let's here's one bit of the path. Wait, let me check to see if anything came up there. ZBrush needs to run. Marshall is already on something. Can't read any further than that. Okay, but that's all right. That's not my business right now. My business is not to read every question, because Will take care of it if I don't see it. I mean, the power of simplicity. Okay, the power of simplicity. Let's get to the next one. You see, this picture doesn't really help most people to draw animals. They say, I don't really want to draw a bunch of skeletons. Maybe you do want to draw a bunch of skeletons. Skeletons are simply where we start with anatomy. We all have different ways we want to draw. I spent years doing detailed drawings where I'd spend 100 hours on a drawing sometimes, put in all the detail and do full-on illustrations with it. I loved it. I'd still like to do some of that. I just don't right now. That's not what I'm doing with my life. But what I want to do with my drawing is to be able to throw things down fast.